Well, welcome back to Managerial Accounting and greetings from my hotel room on Sunday morning in lovely Tamarack, Florida. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. What I wanted to do today was to revisit one of the practice exercises we did in class, and I believe it's exercise 6. And I want to do that all in the context of the previous exercises that we had done leading up to exercise 6. So we went through exercise 6 in class, and I wanted to go back and kind of revisit it and take a big picture view. And to do that, I have a little slide if I can find it here. And now I need to share my screen. And I think if I've done my work correctly, always an interesting challenge when you change venues. You're in unfamiliar office space. So here we go. So what I wanted to do is we want to review the steps to determine total manufacturing costs. And we say total manufacturing costs, we mean the total amount of raw materials incurred in a particular period of time, the total amount of direct labor, and the total amount of overhead. As if Tom were here, he would remind us that direct labor and overhead are combined in this process into what we call conversion costs. So step number 1 was we had to figure out the units to be assigned costs. And this is what we did in exercise 2 on page 124. Here's where we determined what was in beginning inventory, what were the number of units started and completed this period, and what we determined was the number of units that were on hand at the end of the period. So the units to be assigned costs, we took a look at that in exercise 2. Then in exercise 3, we had to determine the equivalent units of materials. When you think of equivalent units, think of how many units of material were added to the process this particular period of time. I think most of the examples that we're looking at a particular month. So we start with a beginning work in process, then we add to that conversion costs, and then we figure out all the units that were started and completed this period. And then we figure out what was left over at the end of the period. And in each case, we have to figure out what the equivalent units were in terms of the materials. So how many units of material were entered into the process this period? After we do that, we have to figure out what the equivalent units were in terms of conversion costs. How many units of conversion costs? Where this gets to be tricky is that the stuff that was in beginning inventory was fully complete with regard to materials, but probably with some percentage complete with regard to conversion costs. So if it was 70% complete with regard to conversion costs at the beginning of the period, that means we've got to add another 30% of conversion costs this period. So we figure out the equivalent units of conversion cost. Once we have both the equivalent units of materials and the equivalent units of conversion costs, we can review the cost and come up with the cost per equivalent unit for both materials and for conversion costs. And then once we do that, we can figure the cost of units transferred out and ending work in process. And that was exercise 6 that we did all these exercises in class. And you can see how 2, 3, 4, and 5 actually lead up to exercise 6. So in exercise 6, I thought that we'd have to go back and review all this stuff, but they actually gave us a little chart which showed us what the equivalent units were for materials, what the equivalent units were for conversion costs. So what you need to do is take the total costs incurred, and then you have to figure out what the equivalent units were, and then you have to allocate that to what was in beginning inventory, what was cost of goods started and completed this period, and then units that were still in inventory at the end of the period. So let's take a look at exercise 6. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And hopefully I'm going to be able to share my screen and go right to there we are. Let's see if I can share my screen now. Back to Zoom. Share screen. Okay, so I'm hoping I got my fingers crossed, which is on my screen here. Yeah, so here we are. So here was the units assigned to cost. Exercise 2, we had to figure out how many units or how many ounces were started and completed this period. Exercise 3, we had to figure out the equivalent cost of materials. What are the total equivalent units for direct materials? So equivalent units for materials. Then we had to get equivalent units for conversion costs. And then we had to figure out the cost per equivalent unit for materials and cost for equivalent unit for conversion costs. And then here's the one we did in class. I want to lead up to here. So they've already gone ahead and reviewed for us what the equivalent units were for materials, what the equivalent units were for conversion. And when you look at it in this context, think of equivalent units as the number of units added to production this period. So if you look at the beginning inventory work in process, we know materials were added at the beginning of the process. So those units, there was no equivalent materials added because materials were added to the process. But they told us there were 1,200 units for conversion costs there. So that was the additional conversion costs that were necessary to get the beginning inventory ready to go into production. Then we had the started and completed this period. And then we've got the units transferred out, stuff that was actually transferred to the other department. So 38,800 materials and conversion costs are 40,000. But we also have to consider the ending work in process. So there'll always be the conversion costs, will always be for work in process since the units are not fully complete. The conversion cost this period for the ending work in process will always be less than what the direct materials were because the direct materials were added at the beginning of the process. So what this means as we price out the components of the total production cost here is that when it comes to materials, when we get the cost of each unit of material for this period, it was based on 45,000 units. And when we get the cost of conversion cost added this period, it was based on 42,480 units of conversion costs. And so they've told us up above the cost per equivalent unit, which we had calculated previously, but they were nice to us. They restated it to us. They said materials are 45 cents and conversion costs are 15 cents. And they also told us that the beginning work in process had a cost of 2,200. So on the basis of this, let me get some more water here. On the basis of this, determine the cost of completed and transferred out of production. So completed and transferred out of production, that's going to be 38,000 units, plus the additional work that was done on the beginning inventory. So determine the cost completed and transferred out, the ending work in process, and the total cost assigned to the filling department. So the total costs are going to be the amount that was transferred out plus the amount that was left. So there's the, as given, all the information. So the question is here, again, we have to figure out, determine the cost of goods completed and transferred out, and the ending work in process, and the total cost assigned. Well, the total cost assigned is going to be the combined total of completed and transferred out and the ending work in process inventory. So you tell me if the summary here is needed in my handwriting here. So we look at the costs that we had to deal with, and we noticed that the beginning work in process, they told us, was $2,200. So as far as this period, since materials are added at the beginning of the period, there was no direct material cost to get that beginning inventory ready for production. However, when it comes to conversion costs, they told us that there was 1,200 units necessary of conversion costs. And go down here, 1,200 units times 15 cents for conversion costs. So it took $180 worth of cost to get that beginning work in process to be actually completed and go into the production process. So they asked the cost completed of beginning work in process, which was the cost at the beginning of the period, plus the $180 worth of conversion costs for the work in process. And now started and completed this period. Well, they told us that we started and completed 38,000 units. So there's 38,000 units. Notice the answer for direct materials and conversion is the same. So it's 38,000 times 45 cents for material, 38,000 times 15 cents for conversion costs. So there is the the total cost of filling that had been completed this period would be the total cost to finish the beginning inventory plus the amount that was started and completed this period. So that gives us 25,660, and we're almost done now. So now we want the work in process ending inventory, and they told us work in process ending inventory at 6,200 equivalent units with regard to materials. So 6,200 times 40 cents, that's where I get my 2,790. And with regard to conversion costs, we only had 2,480 units. 2,480 units times 15 cents gives me 372. So the total amount completed and transferred out is 28,882. And that is comprised of that which is completed and transferred out into production, which is 25,660, and the ending work in process, 3,162. So hopefully you found that review useful. And let's just recap that now. Share screen. There we go. So again, when you do this topic, our goal is what are the steps involved in figuring out total manufacturing costs? So step number one, step number one, is figure out the units to be assigned costs. So here's where you figure out beginning inventory, ending inventory, and the number of units begun and completed this period. Then get the equivalent units of material, which you did in exercise 3. Then get the equivalent units of conversion costs, which you did in exercise 4. Then you get the cost per equivalent unit, which you did in exercise 5. And then you pull it all together in exercise 6, where you figure out the total cost of units transferred out and ending work in process. So I hope you found that little review of this of practice exercise 6 helpful. You will see this again, obviously, in the homework. Those of you who are struggling with the homework, you will see this again on the exam as well. So hope you found that useful. I will also do little mini lectures on the last 2 objectives from this chapter as well. Be well, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Let's go Jets. Take care, everybody.